Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is brought to you by the Star Quest Production Network and is made possible by our many generous patrons. If you'd like to support the podcast, please visit sqpn.com/give. You're listening to episode 366 of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, where we look at mysteries from the twin perspectives of faith and reason. In this episode, we're talking about pets and their end-of-life experiences. I'm Dom Bettinelli, and joining me today is Jimmy Akin. Hey, Jimmy.
Howdy, Dom.
In recent years, scientists have been studying unusual experiences that happen to people as they are approaching death. Collectively, these are known as end-of-life experiences, or ELEs. But it's only now that people are beginning to study whether animals have end-of-life experiences. So, do they? What kind of experiences do they have, and how do they compare to what humans can experience? That's what we'll be talking about on this episode of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. And Jimmy, what do we need to know to begin today's mystery?
Well, as you said in the introduction, scientists have been studying human end-of-life experiences, or ELEs, for some years. Here on Mysterious World, we've been doing episodes that deal with some of them, like terminal lucidity, which we discussed in episode 312, and deathbed visions, which we discussed in episode 318, and we'll discuss more of them in upcoming episodes. We also discussed the possibility that animals, or at least some of them, might have an afterlife. That was back in episode 203, so you can find that at mysterious.fm/203. Well, recently I ran across some fascinating scientific papers about animals, specifically pets, and different aspects of death, so I decided to do some episodes on them. This first episode will look at the period before the animal actually passes on and how animal end-of-life experiences compare to human ELEs. Another episode, which we'll do in the future, will look at after-death communications, or ADCs, involving animals. We talked about human after-death communications in episodes 306 and 307, but just in the last year or so, a couple of papers have come out looking at animal ADCs, so we'll be talking about them as well. The authors of the papers also plan to look at other aspects of animal afterlife, so we may have additional episodes as those papers come out.
Before we go further, let's talk about something that many people may be wondering. Don't only humans have souls? And isn't it church teaching that animals don't have an afterlife?
Well, the answer to both questions is no. First, let's deal with the matter of souls. Now, it is church teaching that humans have souls. We definitely have immortal souls that survive death. That is infallible church teaching. However, the church doesn't have a teaching about animal souls. It's left that question to theologians and philosophers to figure out. And even though there isn't a church teaching on this, there is a very common theological opinion on this question, and it's one that I think is correct. Based on philosophy that goes back to the Greeks, Christian thinkers have actually held that all living things have souls. In fact, it's the soul that makes something alive rather than not alive. So, of course, every living thing has a soul. The question is what type of soul a creature has. Aristotle bases the type of soul on what kind of abilities that a creature has, and that makes sense. If it's the soul that lets something be alive, then it makes sense that the soul is what lets an organism have the abilities it does when it's alive. So Aristotle put souls into three categories: vegetative or nutritive souls, sensitive souls, and rational souls. The type of soul an organism has determines what abilities it has. So plants have vegetative or nutritive souls, which allow them to have metabolism so that they can take in nourishment, and that also allow them to reproduce. Animals then have sensitive souls, which allow the animals to sense and desire things as well as move around. And then humans have rational souls, which allow humans to think and reflect in a way that animals can't.
What do you make of Aristotle's classification of souls?
Well, I think the threefold classification of souls is fine as far as it goes, but I would want to see a finer-grained analysis. I think that it's correct to divide up the number of souls based on what kinds of abilities an organism has. I just think three categories is overly simplistic. For example, some plants have the ability to move at speeds that humans can perceive, like Venus flytraps, which can move fast enough to catch insects. So motion or motility is not exclusive to animals. And similarly, tumbleweeds are designed to tumble or move as part of their life cycle. Similarly, some animals, like birds, can fly, while other creatures, like dogs, can't. So if it's the soul that determines an animal's abilities, birds will need different kinds of souls than dogs. They may both be sensitive souls, but they'll be different kinds of sensitive souls. I thus think that based on the principle that it's the soul that determines what abilities a creature has, that we actually need as many different kinds of souls as we have different kinds of creatures, with each type of soul responsible for the abilities that each type of creature possesses. It may be handy to group them into three larger classes of vegetative, sensitive, and rational, but we need to look deeper than just at those three classes and consider the different types of souls that the different abilities imply. So the soul of a potato is not the same as the soul of a Venus flytrap, even though they're both plants, and the soul of a dog is not the same as the soul of a bird, even though they're both animals.
So how do we relate this to the question of whether animals have an afterlife?
Well, this gets into the second issue I mentioned earlier. According to some thinkers, vegetative and sensitive souls, the kind that plants and animals have, dissolve at death. So you need a rational soul like humans to survive death. But this is not a matter of church teaching. It's just a theological opinion that has been common among many theologians. Since it's only a theological opinion rather than a church teaching, it has no authority of its own. Since the church hadn't put its own teaching authority behind this opinion, the opinion is only as strong as the arguments you can make in its favor. In this case, the opinion is based not on biblical passages, but on philosophical arguments. I looked at those arguments back in episode 203, and I concluded that they didn't work. To the contrary, I found that we actually have empirical evidence that suggests that at least some animals do survive death. I won't go through the reasons why here, but you can listen to episode 203 at mysterious.fm/203 to learn all about it. For our present purposes, the important thing to know is that it is not church teaching, but only a matter of theological opinion that animals don't have an afterlife, and there are reasons to question or even reject this opinion for at least some animals.
If animals do have an afterlife, it would make sense to ask how similar the experiences of animals are to those of humans, including not only what happens to them after death, but what happens to them leading up to death, which is our subject today.
Yeah, so what I'd like to do now is a quick review of the types of experiences that are commonly reported for humans as they approach death. Then we can go through the new research on animals and what kinds of things they experience and compare them. I'm going to divide the kinds of end-of-life experiences that humans present with into four categories. The first category is retreat phenomena, which involves the dying person retreating from contact with other people. The second is contact phenomena, which involves the dying person having contact with other people. The third is rally phenomena, which involves the dying person suddenly improving, either physically or mentally. And the fourth category is awareness phenomena, which involves the dying person displaying unusual forms of awareness.
Then let's go through each of those and talk about how they manifest in humans. What should we know about retreat phenomena as an end-of-life experience?
Well, it's a common human experience to retreat from the activities of ordinary life, including contact with other people, when we're sick, and that includes when we're approaching death. In the old days, before hospitals and hospices, people would retreat to their homes and stay there. They'd typically stay in bed, leading to people describing them as being on their deathbed, which was usually just their regular bed. It's only now they were dying. Today, people have additional options for retreat, such as hospitals and hospices, though they can also receive hospice care at home. One of the reasons for retreat, including during ordinary sickness, is that it lets the person rest and conserve their energy and possibly even get well. However, the desire to retreat is also present when a person is going to die, which is, only understandable. As people are approaching death, they typically don't feel good, and so it's only natural for them to want to retreat and conserve their energy as they're waiting to pass on. However, there may also be something more than that. It's been observed that some humans seem to wait until they are completely alone, even if it's just for a few moments, before they pass on. That doesn't always happen. Many people die surrounded by loved ones, or at least by medical personnel who are in the room with them, but others seem to wait until everyone is out of the room and then pass on. However, as we'll see, there are also some differences in how retreat phenomena can manifest in humans compared to animals. In the main paper that we'll be looking at today, Rupert Sheldrake and his colleagues write,
"It would be very difficult and often impossible for such a person to suddenly leave their home in order to walk away and find a lonely place where they can lie down and die. The notion that the circumstances of death in the modern Western world provide reasons for the apparent lack of typical accounts of last visits and retreating into solitude in this culture is supported by a report about how an old Australian Aboriginal died. One morning, the man who worked in a tannery came to work and went to all his workmates, shook hands with them, said he was glad to have worked with them, and expressed his hope that he wouldn't be forgotten. Because he had never behaved in this manner before, his colleagues didn't know what to make of this. However, he was found dead later that evening, seated alone at an old church of the mission. It seemed as if he knew that his time was over."
So in this case, an Australian man from an Aboriginal culture seemed to sense the approach of his death. He then went to work and said a final goodbye to his co-workers, which would be classified as a last visit, which we'll talk about more in our next category of contact phenomena. And then he apparently retreated to a church to pass on, meaning that this was also an example of retreating into solitude.
If that's what we need to know about retreat phenomena, what about contact phenomena? What should we know about this type of ELE?
Well, one of the most common things that dying humans do is have contact with at least their friends and loved ones, the people that they're close to. And because humans are a verbal species, the dying person or those around him can also let others know what's happening. These days we even have telecommunications, so we can let people know what's happening very quickly and at very great distances. As a result, there are a bunch of ways that contact can happen for a dying human. To illustrate that, I'll mention what happened when my own parents died. In 1996, I was living in California when my mother suddenly and totally unexpectedly had an aneurysm. At the time, people didn't have internet lines that were separate from their phone lines, and I didn't have a cell phone. So I was actually slightly delayed in getting word about my mother. I had been online when my dad first tried calling me, and my modem was using the line, so he couldn't get through. But still, he was able to reach me within about 45 minutes of when he first tried, and I immediately flew back to Fayetteville to be with my mother before she passed on. Then my father had a health crisis in 2008 and went into a coma. My siblings immediately reached me by phone, and I flew back and was there when he came out of the coma. The next year, he had another health crisis, and at that point, he was dying. And even though I wasn't able to fly back, I was able to speak with him by phone and say what I needed to, though he couldn't speak to me at that point. So in both of these cases, we can see how modern technology allowed me to have contact with both of my parents when they were dying. I was notified very quickly and at a great distance. Then I crossed that great distance very quickly in the two cases. And then when my father actually died, I was at least able to tell him I loved him and say a final goodbye over the phone. So between rapid transportation and rapid communication, humans have multiple ways to have contact when someone is dying.
In both of those cases, though, you took steps to make contact with your parents. What about the other way around, where the dying person makes contact with others, like with the Aboriginal man who went to say goodbye to his coworkers?
Well, that also happens, and I have a story similar to that from my family as well. In 1992, my wife, Renee, became seriously ill with colon cancer, and she had not seen her father in over 20 years. Her parents had divorced when she was small, and she frankly resented her father not being in her life. In fact, she had even refused to invite him to our wedding. But once she got the cancer, she asked me if we should contact him. And I said, I think he would want to know. So we did contact him. And there's actually an amazing story connected with that I'll tell one day. But in this case, it was Renee, the dying person, reaching out to make contact. Now, that's a perfectly normal human experience. But sometimes the contact happens in a paranormal way. In situations where there is no normal way for the two people to have contact, it can happen paranormally, according to reports. For example, a healthy person may suddenly have the feeling that someone they know, especially someone they care about, is in danger or is dying or has just died. In general, these are sometimes referred to as crisis impressions. The word crisis is in there because the person is in or has just experienced a crisis situation. And the word impression is there because it's a general term that can cover multiple phenomena. There are actually several different types of crisis impressions that a person may receive. For example, if the person just has a sudden feeling that their loved one is in crisis, it might be classified as crisis telepathy. And if they see the visual appearance of their loved one, it can be classified as a crisis apparition. We'll have more to say about these types of experiences in future episodes.
Then what about the third general category you mentioned, rally phenomena? What should we know about this type of ELE?
A rally is an occasion when someone's condition suddenly improves, and it's well known among medical and hospice workers that people who are dying often have their physical condition suddenly improve. In English, this is referred to as their final rally before they pass on. In Spanish, it's sometimes called the mejoría de la muerte, or the improvement of death. And it can take multiple forms. The person may get more energy, their appetite may suddenly return, and the symptoms that they've been suffering may lessen or vanish. There are also what Rupert Sheldrake and his colleagues have referred to as somatic surprises. In Greek, soma means body, so a somatic surprise is when your body is suddenly able to do something that it hadn't previously been able to do. Sheldrake and others write,
The literature on human ELEs, furthermore, contains examples of somatic surprises. For example, a man born deaf-mute was said to have uttered his first intelligible words during his last hours. A man suffering from high fever and grave articular rheumatism lost his fever and rheumatism after having had a near-death vision, ate a copious meal, and died on the same evening. A woman in a nursing home with severe spinal fusion, which was able to only look down to the floor for several years, noticed one day with surprise that she was able to look out of her room window for the first time, and died soon after. In another case, a man dying from lymphatic cancer who had been unable to move his arm for over a year moved his arm while he experienced a near-death vision.
Then there are sudden mental improvements that can occur shortly before death. This phenomenon is known as terminal lucidity, and we discussed it back in episode 312, so you can go back to mysterious.fm/312 to hear all about it. In cases of terminal lucidity, people who have been suffering from Alzheimer's or dementia or other serious cognitive impairments suddenly lose these impairments shortly before death. For example, here's one of the cases that we discussed back in episode 312 that I find particularly moving. It's about a young German woman who did not have the cognitive capacity to speak. She was completely mute. But when she was getting ready to die, she suddenly started singing German hymns as her own death songs.
One of the more prominent cases of terminal lucidity, also from Michael Naum's case collection and frequently discussed in literature, is that of Anna Katharina Emmer, usually simply known as Kata. Kata, born on May 30th, 1895, began suffering from prolonged seizures at the age of 6 weeks and only learned to walk at the age of 2.5 years. At the age of 6, on June 17, 1901, she was admitted to the psychiatric ward at Hefata in Tresa, Hesse, Germany, where she spent the remainder of her life until her death on March 1st, 1922. The following is from her case file. Kata was a born idiot and never learned to speak a word. She stared at some random spot for hours or fidgeted for hours on end. She gobbled food, excreted, emitted an animal cry, and slept. We have not observed any other stirrings of life on her part in all those long years. Never did we notice her participate in the life around her for as much as a second. She also deteriorated physically. One leg had to be amputated, and her infirmity only increased. In the morning of March 1st, 1922, the day of Kata's death, the nurse told her treating physician that it looked like she might soon die, for the girl had been humming to herself for quite a while. The resident physician, Wilhelm Wittneben, gave the following account of Kata's death. As we entered the death chamber, we couldn't believe our eyes and ears. The born idiot, Kata, sang her own death songs.
Where finds the soul her home, her peace, 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 celestial peace.
Kata sang for half an hour. Her face was spiritual, transfigured. Then she quietly went to sleep. The doctor who, like the nurse, had tears in his eyes, kept saying, "I am before a medical mystery. If required to do so, I can prove by means of a section that Kata's cerebral cortex was utterly destroyed, and that cogitation was anatomically impossible." Kata therefore only appeared not to notice any of the goings-on around her. In fact, she had visibly taken in quite a bit of what took place. For where would she have taken the text and tune of the song if not her surroundings? And she had understood the purport of the song and used it in the decisive hour of her life. It did seem like a miracle. What appeared to be even more of a miracle was that the hitherto utterly mute Kata could suddenly render the song's words clearly and distinctly, even though, caused by numerous onsets of meningitis, such pervasive anatomical changes to the cerebral cortex had occurred that it is not rationally comprehensible how the dying girl could suddenly sing clearly, distinctly, and with comprehension.
So that's one example of terminal lucidity, but there are a lot more. And there's also something else that I should point out about rally phenomena, whether it's a physical final rally or a mental one like terminal lucidity. And that's that this type of end-of-life experience can be connected to other ELEs. For example, if someone suddenly physically improves, like waking up from a coma or something, or if they suddenly lose their Alzheimer's disease, well, then that can facilitate their ability to have contact with others so that they can say their final goodbyes. There can thus be a link between rally phenomena and contact phenomena. There also are a lot of reports of people who manage to stay with us just long enough for their loved ones to arrive to say final goodbyes. And the ability to hang on long enough to see their loved ones can also be understood as an aspect of the person's final rally.
Then let's turn to the fourth type of human end-of-life experiences you wanted to look at. You referred to these as awareness phenomena. What are you thinking of here?
Basically, in these situations, the dying person has awareness of things that other people do not. Here are four things that a dying person may be aware of that I'd like to talk about. The first is the approach of death itself. The second is deathbed visions. The third are numinous phenomena. And the fourth are sensed presences.
Then let's look at the first. What happens when a dying person is aware of the approach of death itself?
Basically, they just know when they're going to die, and this can happen in a number of ways. So, for example, they may just have a sense of when they're going to die, like, I'm going to pass tomorrow, or I'll pass on this week, or this month, or something. This is particularly noteworthy when those around them, like medical professionals, don't think that the person is going to die, or at least die that soon. But it's a well-reported end-of-life experience that humans sometimes somehow know when they're going to die better than their doctors and nurses. And that awareness could be purely natural. It could be that they feel the approach of death in their bodies as their internal systems are breaking down. Although if that were the case, the medical professionals ought to be able to pick up on that, and they don't. It's also possible that the person may have consciously or subconsciously determined that they're going to die around a certain time. There are cases where people believe that they've been cursed to die at a certain time, and then they do. Or they may decide on some level that they just don't want to go on anymore, and so they pass on when they expect to. Sheldrake and colleagues also report
the anticipation of dying at a given time has also been reported in Western patients, but premonitions of death in the absence of physical threats, such as natural catastrophes, might not only be due to passively received impressions. It is known from tribal societies, including Australian Aboriginal people, that they seem able to induce their own death, for example, when they think they've been influenced by sorcery or voodoo practices. Severe psychologically driven effects on one's body that may even lead to death have also been reported from the West. Thus, an active component of psychophysiological influence on the body could also play a role when people and animals seem to anticipate their own death, including retreating into solitude.
We'll definitely discuss scenarios like this in future episodes, and there's a really interesting phenomenon that has been noted in this connection. Basically, even if the dying person isn't lucid, they often start talking about travel or taking a trip soon as death is getting nearer. In an article in the Society for Psychical Research's Sciencyclopedia, Patricia Pearson writes,
as has been reported in several American and British studies, palliative and hospice staff often observe a preoccupation with travel and movement in the dying. This takes the form of pragmatic requests for help to put their shoes on, to find their train ticket, to board the boat, bring the car around, go for a walk, or simply to go home. These occur at a stage when their use of language in general has become limited and stark, and they are therefore quite distinct from febrile mutterings. A near comatose patient may unexpectedly utter a brief phrase about the trip they're about to embark upon. Or they may ask, "When am I going?" Studies show that the answer is invariably within 2 or 3 days, irrespective of medical prognosis. Paramedics and physicians have reported surprise at being told by patients that they are leaving at a time when symptoms do not appear to be terminal. In one study, carried out in a palliative care residence in Quebec, preoccupation with travel was found to feature in patients' end-of-life dreams.
So it's like the dying person has an awareness of the approach of death, even if they're interpreting it in terms of taking a physical trip somewhere. It's also possible that the dying might learn about the time of their death through precognition, or by having it revealed to them, such as in our next category of awareness-based ELEs, which is deathbed visions.
We've discussed deathbed visions, or DBVs, on Mysterious World before. We covered them in episode 318, so people can go to mysterious.fm/318 for that. What did you want to say about them here?
Basically, I wanted to remind listeners that they exist and that we've covered them, but I also wanted to call attention to 2 perceptions that often occur in the context of deathbed visions. One is our third awareness category, which is numinous phenomena. In Latin, the word numen refers to divine power or the divine will or plan. And so in English, something is numinous if it seems supernatural, mysterious, spiritual, or suggestive of the presence of the divine. Patricia Pearson writes,
certain conditions appear to give rise to a state of consciousness that might be characterized as numinous. In this state, percipients feel themselves to be immersed in extremely bright light that they experience as loving and possessed of a sentient quality, indicating that it is no merely visual perception. Feelings of profound peacefulness or joy generally accompany the perception.
And as we discussed in our Deathbed Visions episode, people often report seeing light, hearing music, and things like that. They may also feel the presence of God.
That leaves us with the final awareness category you mentioned, which is sensed presences. What are you thinking of here?
Basically, a dying person or a person in danger of dying may be aware of the presence of individuals other than God. In the Deathbed Vision episode, we talked about how people experiencing DBVs may see angels, or they may see departed loved ones, including loved ones who they didn't even previously know were dead. So they're sensing the presence of these individuals. But the same kind of phenomena don't just happen in deathbed visions. They also happen when a person is in danger of dying. Patricia Pearson writes,
the presence that is visualized, sensed, or heard in both crisis impressions and deathbed visions has been reported in other environments also, where percipients are themselves in danger or psychological distress, or where they have been bereaved. The categories can overlap, as in the case of World War I soldier William Byrd, who was awakened in the trenches by his deceased brother, who insisted that he rise, escorted him out of his tent and well away from it, and disappeared. The tent was then obliterated by a shell.
Sometimes the person may not know the identity of the presence that they're sensing. This is sometimes referred to as the third man. Again, Pearson explains,
the phenomenon of sensing an invisible yet accompanying presence while traversing physically challenging landscapes is well established in mountaineering literature. This presence has been dubbed the third man in reference to a poem by T.S. Eliot that mentions a presence sensed during the 1916 Antarctica expedition led by Ernest Shackleton, and has been frequently reported by mountain climbers, polar explorers, sea voyagers, cave explorers, and deep-sea divers. There are also multiple reports in theaters of war. A typical example is described by John Geiger, head of the Canadian Geographic Society, in his book The Third Man Factor. American climber James Savini was severely injured by an avalanche in British Columbia in 1983. His back, arms, and ribs were broken, and he was bleeding internally. He could not stand and began succumbing to shock and hypothermia. At this point, he sensed a presence. It directed and prodded him over ice-ridden terrain back to his camp. All decisions made were made by the presence. I was merely taking instructions. When he reached his tent, the presence vanished. He was later found and rescued by cross-country skiers.
And we'll definitely have a future episode about the third man phenomenon. I've already been doing research for it. But notice that it's a lot like the presences that the people often sense in deathbed visions. It's just that you have less information about the identity of the person whose presence you're sensing in a third man experience. And it can happen in situations other than your deathbed. In fact, the sensed presence may lead you to safety so that you don't die. Still, this phenomenon exists in continuity with other awareness-based end-of-life experiences in humans. And this brief review of what ELEs are like for humans sets us up for looking at what end-of-life experiences are like for animals.
And before we turn to our animal friends, we do want to stop and thank our patrons who make this show possible, including Theodore V, Jessica D, Mary B, Marie M, and Marty T. Their generous donations at sqpn.com/give make it possible for us to continue Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World and all the shows at StarQuest. And you can join them by visiting sqpn.com/give. Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is also brought to you by DeliverContacts.com, offering top brand contact lenses at always low prices with free delivery. Visit DeliverContacts.com. And by Conceiving Crime, a gripping new true crime podcast uncovering the darkest secrets the abortion, sex, and fertility industries hope you never hear. These industries operate in the shadows, where human life is treated as a product, mistakes are covered up, and crimes go unpunished. From professional surrogacy scammers to families torn apart by IVF, Conceiving Crime exposes the stories no one else will tell. What happens when life itself becomes a business? Find out at conceivingcrime.com or wherever you get your podcasts. So, Jimmy, how do you want to proceed to look at end-of-life experiences in animals?
Basically, I want to go through the human ELE categories that we just described before the break and see how they compare to what's been reported in animals. The research on this is extremely new. While there have been anecdotal accounts in the past, it's only been in the last couple of years that parapsychologists have been turning serious, focused attention on it. In 2023, a key paper was published in the Journal of Scientific Exploration by Rupert Sheldrake, Pam Smart, and Michael Nahm. It was called Experiences of Dying Animals, Parallels with End-of-Life Experiences in Humans. And the Journal of Scientific Explanation is an open access journal, so we'll have a link to where you can read the article for yourself. The journal also requires that people make available the data on which they base their studies, which is another good thing that parapsychologists frequently do. So we'll have a link to where you can get a spreadsheet of additional data connected with the study from Rupert Sheldrake's website. And this kind of research really hadn't been done before. The authors write,
because our study is the first of its kind and is limited in scope, we recommend further research in this field. We are confident that such studies would elicit many other reports about remarkable behavioral feats of animals during their last phase of life, thereby elucidating facets of their lives that have so far received only little attention, but help to understand the dying process in animals better. The conspicuous similarity of end-of-life experiences in human beings and non-human animals could also increase the recognition that animals share an inner life similar to that of humans, which could lead to a more respectful treatment of animals. In these supplementary materials, we make all the case studies in our collection available for anyone who would like to study further examples.
And as I said, we'll have a link to the spreadsheet of the supplementary material. The paper was based specifically on what people reported about their own animals. So the study is about dogs and cats and horses and things like that. The authors write,
"At the time of writing, our database contains about 150 entries of varying quality in which people described behavior of animals that seemed to be related to their impending death. Many case reports contained features that allowed us to group these experiences into specific categories. Notwithstanding that some cases could be allocated to more than one category, we classified 114 examples pertaining to the classification scheme shown in Table 1, together with the number of cases in each category at the time of writing. Of these 114 case reports, we present 43 representative cases in this publication. The other 71 cases are available online as supplementary material so that readers can review them for themselves." Then let's go through the categories that you proposed for human ELEs. The first was retreat phenomena, where a dying person retreats from typical daily activities, such as by resting at home or in a hospital or hospice. How does this compare with what animals experience at the ends of their lives?
The retreat phenomena is even more marked in animals than in humans. Sheldrake and Associates classified 10 of their 114 reports, or about 9%, as having a retreat to solitude being the most prominent element of the experience. The authors state,
"Another seemingly typical phenomenon reported from animals is their retreat into solitude before dying. Gaddis and Gaddis, 1970, reported an account concerning a dog that was badly mauled in a fight. After its wounds had been treated and it seemed to recover, it disappeared one day. Soon after, its owner had a vivid dream of the dog in which it appeared to stand on a particular knoll. The dog was found later on this knoll. It was dead. As the following examples from our collection illustrate, animals sometimes gather enough physical strength to bid farewell to their loved ones prior to leaving."
We'll talk about animals bidding farewell to their owners in the next section, and the particular incident previously reported by Gaddis and Gaddis had an additional element of a dream revealing where the dog had died, but the dog displayed the common animal behavior of retreating to a place of safety to expire. The same was found in Sheldrake and his associates' own database. For example, they preserved this report.
"Our cat Anton was the classic tabby house cat. We received him when he was a little kitten. He was 16 years old when, in the summer of 2008, his health declined drastically. For weeks, Anton had only lain in the shade under a big bush near our house in the garden. I fed him minced meat with my fingers, and from time to time, I gave him a cracked egg, which he licked from the bowl, remaining in his procumbent position. One evening, on another balmy summer evening, when the front door was open and I was doing the dishes, he dragged himself into the house and joined me in the kitchen at his feeding place. I turned to him and we looked at each other briefly. Then I knelt on the floor and he rubbed his head against my leg. He was very loving and strong, like in healthy days, so full of devotion. That really touched me a lot. I stroked him for quite a while. He purred barely audibly. His body felt relaxed, although he had become only skin and bones and his fur was so shaggy. Then abruptly he rose and limped outside again. I closed the front door and knew that he would die very soon. The next morning his place under the bush was empty, and I could not find him in the surrounding area. Our son, who came to visit on August 21st, 2008, went to search for him. Finally, he found him in the back of the garden, still breathing shallowly, surrounded by flies. I was surprised how much strength Anton had mustered to cover this distance, since he'd not been able to walk for weeks before. Our son sat next to him. 2 hours later, our son came into the house and wanted to call the vet to finally release Anton from his misery. Then the classical scenario developed that is also reported frequently from dying people. They die exactly at a time when they are finally alone, for example, when their caregivers need to go to the restroom or fetch a cup of coffee. When our son and the vet arrived at Anton, he had already taken his last breath on his own.
There are several aspects to this report, including the last rally that gave Anton the strength to come inside for a bit and then make it to a more distant place. It also includes a final goodbye to Anton's owner. But the reason that it's in this category is that Anton retreated to a private place to die, and this is very common. There are multiple other cases like this in the author's collection, and they also speculate about the reasons for this retreating behavior.
In the animal kingdom, the final retreat to a lonely place could represent a biologically driven instinct in order not to contaminate the kin's favorite dwelling place with a rotting corpse, or not to hinder their wandering and hunting activities. Among wild animals, such behavior might even be more pronounced and pertain to sick and injured individuals as well, because undisturbed resting in solitude can have beneficial effects on healing processes. William Long, an experienced naturalist, observed that every stricken bird or beast seeks instinctively to be alone and quiet while his hurt is healing.
Since humans are much better at dealing with the bodies of the departed and removing them for burial or cremation, in part because we got hands, the instinct to go off and die may not be as strong in us, though it might still explain those cases where people seem to wait until they're completely alone and then pass on.
Let's look at the next category of phenomena you listed, which was contact phenomena, where the dying has contact with loved ones. Are these also reported among animals?
Oh, they are. Animals definitely like having contact with their loved ones as death is approaching. And sometimes it at least appears to the owners that the animals are deliberately seeking them out in order to have contact with them and say a final goodbye. The author's right.
The dominant feature in many of the case reports is that the pet seeks to say goodbye to their owners or other loved ones. Typically, these pets are already very weak and they die soon after this final farewell. Gaddis and Gaddis already reported such a case. During the prime of its days, a tomcat named Pussy was taught by the couple who kept him to hold out a paw to shake hands. As Pussy grew older, he suffered from severe chronic dysentery and had to be put down. When the vet arrived, the cat dragged himself out of his basket, walked straight to its sorrowful keepers, and held out his paw to each of them in turn. He then crept back into his basket, buried his head in his paws, and awaited his fate. Some of the reports we received are remarkably similar.
So in this case, which was reported back in 1970, the cat had been taught a greeting ritual, and just before it was put down, the cat initiated the ritual with each of its owners, looking very much to them like the cat was deliberately saying goodbye. This was the single most common kind of report that Sheldrake and his colleagues found in their case collection, representing 53 of 114 cases, or 46% of the total, almost half. For example, one correspondent reported,
"This is the sad but true story of what our family experienced with our dog Foxy. We all loved the dog because it was so friendly, devoted, and loyal, as well as very watchful and clever. When the dog became old, it could not hear so well anymore, ate less, and became weak. Finally, at the age of 14, it could barely move from its resting place. Then one day, the following happened. The whole family sat at the dinner table when the good dog struggled to its feet, went around from one to the next, sadly looked at everybody, and gave paws to each member of the family. Then it trudged back, slowly lay down, and died. You can believe me, we had tears in our eyes after this goodbye scene. The dog had felt the end and pulled itself together for a final goodbye to all of us."
Another correspondent reported,
Baker, the cat our son and daughter-in-law adopted, was sociable on his own terms and would appear for a while when we visited them and then disappear. Knowing we were family, he was affectionate with us, but briefly. The last time we saw him, as he was clearly dying, he came in as usual. But this time, he made the rounds, sitting in each of our 4 laps for 15 minutes or so, and then moving to the next lap, as if clearly saying goodbye. When he died very soon afterward, and I mentioned the incident, each of the 4 of us said that they had sensed the exact thing at the time, that he was aware of his imminent death and was saying goodbye.
There are many more examples that Sheldrake and his colleagues collected, but they fit the same pattern. Just before death, the animal appears to interact with each of the family members in a way that they interpret as saying goodbye. such as the dog Foxy going around the dinner table and shaking hands with everyone, or the cat Baker spending 15 minutes in each person's lap before moving on to the next person. And these cases would seem to be motivated by an awareness phenomenon. We can't be sure of this since animals can't talk, but it appeared to the owners that the animals knew or were aware of the approach of the time of their death, and that's what led them to deliberately say goodbye. Now, in these cases, the animal was living with the family members it wanted to say goodbye to, but that isn't always the case. Sometimes a pet wants to say goodbye to someone who doesn't live in the same household, and the animal must cross a distance to say goodbye. The authors refer to this phenomenon not simply as a last goodbye, but as making a last visit, since the animals have to make a visit to say the goodbye. They explain,
in this category, we included accounts in which animals visited loved ones for a last goodbye. The case reports in this category are very similar to the previous one. But rather than conveying a last goodbye at home, the animals grouped here factually crossed a distance between two different locations. Such a case had already been reported by inventor and futurist Nikola Tesla, according to whom a pigeon he was particularly fond of flew into his room one night with the seeming purpose of informing him that it was dying and to say goodbye. In their book on remarkable aspects of animal life, Gaddis and Gaddis included an intriguing case that represented a case of sigh trailing. A dog found a beloved caretaker in a location it had never been to and then died there. The three cases reported below concern dogs who visited the homes of their former keepers or caretakers and then returned to their present homes. The first of these cases is particularly notable as it involves the comparably rare aspect of sigh trailing as well.
and we will definitely have a future episode on the sigh trailing phenomenon. Of the 114 cases in this data set, the authors classified 6 or 5% of them as last visits. So this was not as common as last goodbyes that don't involve a visit outside of the household. Not that many pets have significant others living outside the household that they might want to visit, but such cases are reported. Now here is the one the authors just mentioned.
For many years, I had a mongrel dog called Bruce. When I started courting, I spent less time with him, although I still loved him. In turn, he turned his affection toward a girl who lived not very far away, who took him long walks, and occasionally she would ask if she could keep him at weekends. After Mother died, my father decided to move house several miles away. What to do with Bruce was a problem, which was resolved when my friend said she would love to have him. Many years later, on a lovely summer's evening, I heard scratching outside the bedroom window of my new home. I opened it, and looking down, I saw the white-haired face of Bruce. You can imagine the excitement in the household. We made such a fuss over him. However, in the early hours of the morning, he made indications it was time to go. I can still see him walking away over the field, stopping and looking back. I met my friend while shopping a few weeks later, who informed me Bruce had died. He had gone missing one night, returning early the following day, and had passed away 3 days later. It is especially remarkable that Bruce had never been to the new address, and we had been parted for over 5 years. The dog had to cross over a bridge and travel over 3 miles to find me in my new address.
So in this case, it appears that Bruce sensed he was going to die, and he was able to find his former family and say goodbye to them, even though he'd never been to their new location. It was over 3 miles away, and they had moved 5 years earlier. That may be sigh trailing, or he may have used psychic functioning to track him down. Or it might have a natural explanation. If the dog was allowed to roam free, it might have over time learned where the family was now living just by smell, and then it was able to find them when it needed to. Here's another case of an animal seeming to visit people who it wanted to say goodbye to.
We lived next door to a family who had a female black lab. Her name was Oreo. She was such a gentle dog, and whenever her people would go away and leave her at home, my husband would go over, feed her, and take her for walks. Only once or twice did she come into our house, and only then when her master was with her. About 2 years ago, one afternoon, she was standing at our front door by herself. As I opened the door, she insisted on coming in, which was very unusual. She walked all over the house and finally came to me in the kitchen and laid down by my feet and stayed there. After a while, I phoned my neighbor to tell her that the dog was in our house. She could not explain how the dog got out of the yard as the gate was closed, and she was in no condition to jump over the fence. Later the same day, she turned up at the neighbor across the street. He too, from time to time, looked after her. After he phoned the mistress of Oreo, she went to pick the dog up and took her home. The next day, Oreo became very sick, and the mistress took her to their veterinarian. After examining her, it was determined that nothing could be done for Oreo. That night, she went down into their basement. The neighbor followed her and stayed with the dog. A few hours afterwards, she was dead. I am convinced that the dog knew that she was to die and came to say goodbye to the people who were kind to her. Still to this day, my heart becomes heavy whenever I think of how that dog came to say thank you and goodbye. In these cases, the animals were able to physically visit the people that they apparently wanted to say goodbye to, and the reverse tends to happen with sick humans. When people in hospitals or hospices have their loved ones come to visit them, or at least speak with them by telephone. But what happens with animals if a physical visit isn't possible? Do they make contact by crisis telepathy or crisis apparitions like humans are reported to?
This initial study only had 114 quality reports, and none of the ones that Sheldrake and his associates found were examples of that, but I am aware of such phenomena in other situations. For example, back in episode 298 on pet telepathy, we recounted this story, which comes from a woman named Dolores Katz of Deming, New Mexico.
One day, while at work, it started to thunder and rain. As I worked, I became increasingly edgy, then very agitated. Something was wrong. At this point, I will add that I never took time off from work. I asked my employer if I could take the afternoon off. I didn't feel quite right. On my way home, I knew Eric, my German Shepherd, was in trouble. I knew he was bleeding. When I arrived home, I rushed to the back patio. The window was broken. Frightened by the thunder outside, Eric had hit the glass with his paw and had sliced off the front pads on the broken glass. He was bleeding very badly. I feel he needed me and called out the only way he could, telepathically, knowing I would come to him.
So this was an example of crisis telepathy. The German Shepherd, Eric, was in crisis because the thunder had frightened him. He had crashed through a window and was now bleeding very badly. So it appears he telepathically reached out to his owner and she came home to help him. He didn't end up dying, so this isn't an end-of-life experience, but I'm sure that with a larger sample size, more cases of animal crisis telepathy and animal crisis apparitions would appear in the end-of-life situations.
Then let's look at your next major category, rally phenomena. Do animals, like humans, seem to have a last rally before dying, either a physical one or a mental one?
They do, and there have been hints of that in some of the experiences that we've already covered. Several of the animals who were able to say last goodbyes and make last visits seem to have rallied shortly before their deaths, like the black lab Oreo, who came to visit the families that had been kind to her, but her owner said she was in no condition to have jumped over the fence and get out. So it looks like she rallied, and that it was the rally that let her make the last visits. Here's what the authors have to say about this phenomenon.
In some of the presented cases, the animals appeared to muster an extra strength to say goodbye. A pronounced surge of vitality in animals shortly before dying was, in fact, a frequent feature of the cases reported to us, and we therefore group them into a specific category. Such increased vitality has long been known to occur in some dying people. Typically, it involves enhanced physical vigor, but there can also be a surprising improvement in the mental state of people who were previously drowsy, confused, or even comatose, that is, terminal lucidity. There are various names in different cultures and languages for this remarkable increase in vitality. As evidenced in the examples given below, many of our correspondents were deeply impressed by the last rally of their pets. As a veterinarian informed us, such occurrences are not even rare, saying, "In my practice as a vet, experiencing the last rally in dogs isn't uncommon. It happened already a number of times that when I rang the bell of a house I was called to in order to put a dog down, a vital and barking canine greeted me and jumped around me. I was surprised already more than once that when I asked its owners where the sick dog is that I was supposed to put down, they informed me that this seemingly vital animal would be the moribund dog in question.
And I should mention, since not everyone is familiar with the term, that moribund means being in a state of dying or at the point of death. Of the 114 cases in the data set, 28 of them, or 25%, involved a notable last rally. Actually, probably more did, but in 25% of the cases, the last rally was the most notable feature, which is what you needed to earn a place in this category, since the authors assigned only one category to each report. The authors then go on to document last rally cases involving dogs, cats, birds, and other animals. Here's one that involves a dog.
Princess Lavender was my baby girl for 11 years. She had congestive heart failure for 8 months before she passed. Her veterinarian prescribed medicines that helped her. On March 4th, 2021, she passed away. Around 1 a.m., I was up with her because her breathing was very unsteady and she was not able to stand on her own. I had to go to work at 3 a.m., and my husband was with her till I came home at 10 a.m. While at work, I called the veterinarian's office and was told that the vet would see her at 10:30 a.m. We decided to help her pass with the doctor. When I got home, she was her young self. She was running around, playing, jumping up and down, giving me kisses, just her young self. We went to the vet's office, and the doctor looked at her and told us she would not do what we had planned, that she was doing very well. So we had decided to go on vacation. We had already planned to leave on this day, and drove 4 hours to the house we were renting. Princess loved the drive. When we arrived at the house, she bounced out of the car and took off running, checking out the place and smelling like crazy. She ate, drank water, took a nap, and then played a little with her ball and me and was doing great. Around 7 p.m., I checked on her and she was not doing good with breathing. I held her for 5 minutes, telling her how much we loved her, how much we would miss her, and telling her that it was okay to pass on. She gave me a kiss and took her last breath.
Now here's a last rally experience with a cat.
5 weeks ago, my cat was dying, not eating or drinking for days, hiding under the bed. Then the next day, she suddenly perked up and was very active. She was jumping on furniture, following me around, and acting like she was healthy and young. It went on for hours. I felt it was a gift. But the next morning, she was back hiding under the bed, refusing to eat or drink. We had a vet come to the house 2 days later to put her down. I've had multiple pets in my 77 years and never experienced anything like this.
And finally, here's one that involves both a horse and a goat.
I run a very large animal sanctuary in Australia and oversee every soul who passes. They usually know when they're going. I had a racehorse who was dying of snakebite with us, frantically trying to save her. Suddenly she got up and we were able to lead her to a stable. We thought she was healing, but she died the next day. This type of rally for me is part of the dying process. Dying animals will get very active. We just lost a beloved old goat who wandered up to the hay shed and gorged himself. We knew it was his last rally.
Now, one of the things that we've mentioned is how some humans seem to delay their deaths until certain things happen, like waiting for their relatives to arrive for a last goodbye before passing on. Here's an example of that kind of thing happening with a dog.
Our dog Coyote was dying. The boys were grown and moved away, as it should be. My husband and I were sitting vigil. Out of the blue, our elder son called and said he was driving through town, and although it was late, he wanted to drop in. He lived hours away. Another son called and took a zip car home from the city. My husband and I had been sitting vigil for 2 days, giving our beloved dog all the care and permission to go. Only once the boys were home, Coyote visibly relaxed and crossed over. It seemed she could not go until her family, tribe, pack were present. It was uncanny and beautiful. I know she called out and called the boys home.
Of course, waiting for loved ones to arrive is not the only potentially meaningful reason that one might struggle to hang on for. Here's an example involving a cat in which the owner made an emotionally meaningful request.
We adopted my first cat, Amelia, when she was about 3 months old. She had feline leukemia and other immunodeficiencies that took her life 3 years later, despite all our efforts to help her. The night that she was dying on my legs around 5 a.m., I thanked her for having accompanied me for those wonderful 3 years, and for having helped me lose my fear of cats. I asked her to join me for another hour to watch the sunrise together. At that moment, almost by magic, she stood up, raised her head, licked my hand, and together we watched the sunrise from my window. And around 6 a.m., the moment the sun came up and touched our window, she looked at me, leaned back on my legs, and exhaled deeply. That was the last breath of her. I am a nurse of critical patients in Chile, and it is common for us to observe the famous mejoria de la muerte in terminally ill people or with different pathologies, but in animals I had never observed it. With Amelia, it was my first time.
The authors of the paper also had a category for specific types of rallies that they referred to as somatic surprises. They classified 2 of the 114 examples, or about 1%, as falling into this category, and they explain,
sometimes the last rally or terminal vitality goes hand in hand with physical improvements or movements that seemed inconceivable before because of the animal's handicap or injury. Below we present 2 examples. One correspondent said, I have a story about a cat that I found on the road with a broken neck and brought home to die. It was with me 3 days and never moved, just panted. Just before it died, it got up, stretched, meowed very loud, purred into my hand, and then lay down dead. A second correspondent said, I want to share an experience with our 16-year-old dog, Lucy. Lucy's hips were giving up, and she dragged her right leg to walk. We made arrangements for a home visit to end her pain. We had a carpet laid out in the backyard for what turned into a beautiful ceremony. After the doctor arrived, Lucy immediately walked outside with no limping to the carpet and lay down.
Sheldrake and his colleagues also found reports of what looks like terminal lucidity among animals. These represented 7 of the 114 reports, or about 6% of them. They explain,
the mental equivalent of somatic surprises is terminal lucidity, the already mentioned unexpected improvement of mental alertness or faculties shortly before death in creatures that have previously been in a drowsy, confused, or even unconscious state. Naturally, somatic surprises and terminal lucidity can occur concomitantly, as in the following example. It concerns the aftermath of a sudden accident involving a bird that seemingly turned unconscious and motionless after the accident. Although the bird's final malaise was only of comparably short duration, this case can still be counted as an instance of terminal lucidity.
They then relate the following report.
One day, a bird crashed into the cabin I live in, and I ran outside to see about it. As I picked up this bird, a large thrush, it just lay still in my hands, its eyes closed, and I assumed it had broken its neck and was dying. I began to say a small prayer for its soul and put my thumb on its heart as its beats got slower and slower. But then, just as the heart was about to stop, this bird, with a broken neck, managed to turn its head and open its eyes and look right into mine for a few moments. Then it closed its eyes again, turned its head to the side, and was dead. Was it making contact with life for one more moment? This has long haunted me.
I understand why this haunted the person who witnessed it, but I'm not convinced that this should be classified as terminal lucidity. It strikes me that the witness may have simply misunderstood how injured the bird was, that it hadn't really broken its neck. It was fatally injured, but this doesn't strike me as a convincing case of the animal equivalent of terminal lucidity in humans, which tends to involve long-standing cognitive issues like Alzheimer's suddenly vanishing, or at least something that's been going on for days, not just being dazed and confused for a few seconds. However, there are other cases in the data set that are better. Of course, one of the problems is that since animals aren't verbal, we can't as easily evaluate whether they're demented or how much cognitive impairment they're experiencing, which is something that the authors note.
Because the communication of animals is more difficult to decipher than that of other human beings, it is hard to determine whether an animal is confused or demented, and thus if a last goodbye or rally before death also implied an instance of terminal lucidity. Nevertheless, we received a number of case reports according to which the mental state of the moribund animals was clearly impaired before they seemed to brighten up for a very last time and provided them with the opportunity to bid farewell.
And here's an example of such a case report.
My pet was a 6-year-old Chihuahua that developed a brain tumor. He was basically out of it, did not respond to my wife or me, and was having occasional convulsions. The night before he was to be put down, we were at the vet for a brief time, about 30 minutes, and he was completely normal. He jumped up in my lap, wanted to play like everything was normal, then he went to my wife and did the same thing. All of this happened in about a 30-minute time frame, and then he went back out of it and convulsing. We told the vet about this, and he said he had never heard of this before, and that the dog would not recover. Anyway, that did happen, and my wife and I believe he was saying goodbye.
To my mind, this is a much clearer example of terminal lucidity. The dog had a brain tumor, which is one of the things that can cause dementia in humans too. The tumor was advanced enough that the dog had lost normal mental function and was out of it and convulsing for a sustained period. And the effects of brain tumors that are impinging on your central nervous system don't typically just vanish, but in this case, they did for a brief period right before death, and that's exactly what terminal lucidity looks like in humans. So I think this one is a solid case.
Then let's look at your fourth overall category of experiences, which were awareness phenomena. One of these was being aware of the approach of death. You've already noted that experiences like last goodbyes and last visits seem to presuppose an awareness of death. But is there more than that we should say here?
There is. In some instances, the most notable characteristic of an experience was the animal's seeming awareness of its oncoming death. The authors referred to these as unusual premonitions of death, and they represented 5 of the 114 reports, or about 4% of them. The authors state,
several of the previous case reports indicated that the moribund animals knew that their lives were about to end. These premonitions are quite remarkable, given that even the minds of higher mammals, such as dogs and cats, are often thought to be not developed enough to be able to form a concept of dying and their own death.
And I'll interrupt for a moment to say that it's debated how well higher animals can conceptualize death. There's a recent book by Susan Monceau called Playin' Possum, How Animals Understand Death, and she argues that they understand it much better than we think they do. I'm still reading the book and evaluating her argument, but we may discuss it in the future, and there is a plausible case that if you're a predator whose life depends on killing other animals, then you kind of understand what death is because you need to cause it before you can eat your prey. Anyway, the authors continue.
Nevertheless, the animals in the presented examples had been very old and or ill already, and might have felt their powers fading. They also might have reacted in response to altered physiological processes and left their pack out of a biological instinct. It is therefore even more intriguing that we also received reports that concerned comparatively healthy animals that nevertheless displayed premonitions of their impending threat to their lives, such as the following 2 cases.
They then cite an example from some decades ago.
It happened during the Second World War in Houffalize, Belgium, probably in 1944. An old man who owned sheep had died. He had no family. My grandfather decided to lead the sheep into his garden and into a kind of veranda or greenhouse near the main building. The sheep didn't have a problem with living in this new environment for a few days, but one evening they all began to bleat very loudly all night through. The 8 children who lived in the house, including my mother, didn't understand what was happening and considered the sheep's behavior very curious. It was difficult, if not impossible, to sleep. Early in the morning, a bomb hit the greenhouse and killed all the sheep. My mother told me this story. It was impossible for her to forget it. Author's note, the little town, Houffalize, suffered from an intense bombardment in December 1944.
So in this case, the sheep reacted unusually just before the greenhouse they were housed in was bombed, and that seemed to suggest that they sensed the oncoming danger to their lives. Now, here's the second and more recent experience.
In the summer of 1997, my daughter was working on a grant under Dr. Blank at a university in California. Part of her duties was to retrieve the cage with the lab rats. They were part of a cancer research program and, as such, had been injected with live cancer tumors and then different medicines to study the results. Each of the rats was color-dotted to determine how long they had been on the medications. and every so often the rats would be sacrificed so the cancer in the organs could be studied. My daughter, not really sympathetic to lab rats, became concerned when she noticed a regular phenomenon. On the day the rats were to be sacrificed, unlike days when they were being weighed and measured, the rats would all gather in a corner, heads facing the center of a circle, and they would be squeaking and showing signs of alarm. As my daughter said to me, "Mom, they know. Somehow, they know."
So again, the rats seemed to know when they were going to be killed, though without a controlled study, I wouldn't necessarily attribute this to precognition on their part. It may be true that somehow they know, like the daughter said, but this might be because they had seen previous groups of rats being sacrificed and they observed something in the behavior of the scientists that signaled that was about to happen to the other rats, and then they saw the same behavior on the day that they were going to be sacrificed. However, that couldn't apply to the sheep in the greenhouse since they bleated all night before the bomb fell. So they displayed what seemed to be an awareness before the bombing planes could have been within earshot, even for animals. I thus wouldn't dismiss precognition. The authors also have an interesting addendum on this type of experience.
Regarding the category of unusual premonitions of death or of grave danger, the literature on psychical research contains numerous examples already, both in people and in animals. Regarding animals, for example, members of various vertebrate and invertebrate species have been reported to anticipate natural catastrophes such as earthquakes, volcano eruptions, and tsunamis. Moreover, just as in our example of the sheep that had been killed in an air raid in Hufvudstaden during the Second World War, several people have already reported that animals displayed very unusual behavior during war times. This behavior was often, and apparently correctly, interpreted as a premonition and warning of immediate danger. In Freiburg in Germany, for example, the conspicuous and alarming behavior of a duck warned many people who lived in its surroundings that an unexpected air raid was about to strike their quarter in November 1944. Many inhabitants were able to save their lives, but the duck was killed by the bombs. In 1953, the township erected a memorial for the bird in a public park. In fact, the extraordinary behavior of animals that indicated the anticipation of danger while people did not notice anything unusual, and also their sometimes frightened behavior in context of hauntings, has made many people speculate about the possibility that animals possess psychic abilities that surpass those of humans in our modern, reason-dominated Western civilizations.
And that's a reasonable speculation. Our culture tends not to believe in psychic functioning, and one of the things that research has shown is that people who don't believe in psychic functioning perform less well on ESP tests than those who do believe in it. Ironically, this was named the sheep-goat effect by parapsychologist Gertrude Schmeidler after the parable of the sheep and the goats in Matthew 25. We can talk more about the sheep-goat effect in the future, and we'll definitely be talking more about animal precognition in the future. But it does seem reasonable to me that animals might have greater psychic functioning to help them navigate the world, since, in comparison to us, they don't have the gift of human-level reason to help them navigate it, so they might need psychic functioning more than we do.
Then let's look at the next type of awareness phenomena you mentioned, which was deathbed visions. What can we say here?
Well, this will be the last category we'll look at, because here we're facing a serious hurdle in that animals can't talk. So it's not like we witness them having conversations with their departed loved ones who have come to welcome them into the afterlife. We also don't hear them describing the beautiful light they're seeing and the beautiful music or birdsong or howling or whatever that they're hearing. Their nonverbal status is a serious obstacle to learning about whether animals experience this category, but we can at least watch the animals and see if they look like they are reacting to something unseen at the point of death. Consequently, we can conjecture that they might be experiencing such deathbed visions. And Sheldrake and colleagues did find 3 of their 114 reports, or about 2.5% of them, as having this as the dominant characteristic. They termed this category near-death visions, but they put a question mark after it since we can't be sure that that's what was happening. They explained this way.
Among ELEs known from human beings, near-death visions are a prominent feature. In these experiences, sick people report glimpses into what appears to them as a transcendental afterlife realm. Frequently, they perceive apparitions of deceased loved ones or spiritual figures who come to prepare them for their transition. In the vast majority of cases, these experiences are regarded as very comforting and soothing. Sometimes near-death visions go hand in hand with terminal lucidity and a transiently improved physical strength. It is intriguing that, judging from their behavior, also some of the moribund animals in our reports might have experienced a similar vision.
And here's an example of that.
Our dog Snowy died on 30 June 2004. She was in a coma for several hours. Initially, her level of consciousness fluctuated somewhat, and she was calmed. Then she fell into a deep coma in which she was unresponsive to sound stimuli from about noon that day until her eventual death at 11:45 p.m. At about 6 p.m., she was more clearly very weak and had altered consciousness. She did not respond to tactile stimuli, which were not painful. We did not perform painful stimuli for humane reasons. At about 7 p.m., Snowy suddenly sat upright, looked as if she was looking at an object very, very intensely, and followed that object with her eyes. Her head moved slightly from side to side. If a dog could smile, she would smile. You could see a certain happiness radiating from her. She started wagging her tail for a few seconds, then collapsed and fell back into a coma. All 4 members of my family witnessed this: my wife, myself, and 2 teenagers, my daughter and my son. Although I and my daughter were particularly aware of this. We both independently and immediately noticed that it was a very strange thing happening. We spoke almost simultaneously, recording our amazement. I interpreted this as a possible near-death vision.
And I would agree. In this case, just a few hours before death, the dog, which had been comatose, suddenly snapped to attention, tracked something with its eyes, turning its head to do so, and displayed signs of happiness, such as wagging its tail. That sounds like the canine equivalent of what happens in deathbed visions for humans. I'd also note that because the dog tracked something with its head and eyes, that sounds like it was seeing a visible presence, like maybe a person or an animal that it previously knew who had died, or maybe an angel. Of course, you could say that the dog was just having a hallucination, but that's what skeptics say about human deathbed visions too. Still, because animals can't describe what they're experiencing, and thus we can't know whether they're gaining verifiable information that goes beyond random chance through these experiences, which does happen with human deathbed visions, our understanding of animal deathbed visions must remain more tentative than our understanding of human DBVs, at least until we develop mechanical telepathy helmets that let us scan the visual centers of the animal's brain and generate images of what they're seeing, something that is under development right now.
Jimmy, thus far, you've given some of your own thoughts on individual points, but now let's formally shift to the reason perspective. What do you think of the paper and animal end-of-life experiences as a whole?
Well, as the authors point out, this is a first-of-kind study, so as always in science, we want replication before we draw any firm conclusions. Also, the data set is only 114 reports, so we need a lot more data for firm conclusions. And we face the complicated factor that animals are nonverbal. We can only make tentative inferences based on their observed behavior, so we need to be cautious in the conclusions that we draw. However, it does look like animals may have the same kind of end-of-life experiences that humans do. Some of these may be purely natural, like the desire to retreat to a private place as death approaches, a physical last rally, an awareness that the end is near, and a desire to say goodbye to one's loved ones, at least if the animals have an understanding of what death is. Other experiences may involve paranormal elements, like at least the unusual premonitions of death and deathbed visions. But this is all still super tentative, and we need more data, and we need to be careful.
Assuming that we get that data and the author's proposals hold up, what can we say about animal ELEs from the faith perspective? Would such experiences mean that they're fully equal to humans?
No, it wouldn't. Contrary to what Ingrid Newkirk, the president of PETA, has said, a rat is not a pig, is not a dog, is not a boy. Animals are still animals, and they are fundamentally different from humans. To give one illustration of this, I'll cite something that a Mysterious World listener here in Northwest Arkansas told me. He's into homesteading, and as part of that, he raises pigs. The first time he slaughtered his pigs, as soon as he'd slaughtered the first one, the other pig moved over to start lapping up the blood of its companion. So, no, animals are not humans. They do not have a human nature, they do not have human values, and they do not have human rights. I thus endorse what the Catechism of the Catholic Church says when it states,
2415. The seventh commandment enjoins respect for the integrity of creation. Animals, like plants and inanimate beings, are by nature destined for the common good of past, present, and future humanity. Use of the mineral, vegetable, and animal resources of the universe cannot be divorced from respect for moral imperatives. Man's dominion over inanimate and other living beings granted by the Creator is not absolute. It is limited by concern for the quality of life of his neighbor, including generations to come. It requires a religious respect for the integrity of creation. 2416. Animals are God's creatures. He surrounds them with his providential care. By their mere existence, they bless him and give him glory. Thus, men owe them kindness. We should recall the gentleness with which saints like St. Francis of Assisi or St. Philip Neri treated animals. 2417. God entrusted animals to the stewardship of those whom he created in his own image. Hence, it is legitimate to use animals for food and clothing. They may be domesticated to help man in his work and leisure. Medical and scientific experimentation on animals is a morally accepted practice if it remains within reasonable limits and contributes to caring for or saving human lives. 2418. It is contrary to human dignity to cause animals to suffer or die needlessly. It is likewise unworthy to spend money on them that should as a priority go to the relief of human misery. One can love animals. One should not direct to them the affection due only to persons.
So I don't have a problem using rats in cancer research to hopefully save human lives. It's just that when they're sacrificed, it needs to be done in a humane way. Similarly, we can use animals for food. If a mountain lion can eat meat, mountain lions being obligate carnivores, then so can we. It may turn out, as we argued in episode 203 on Animal Afterlife, and as we've covered today, that animals may be more similar to us than some have suspected, but they are still not us, and we should not act as if they are. As the Catechism says, one can love animals, but one should not direct to them the affection due only to persons. By the way, while I was researching this episode, I ran across a book by Wesley Smith called A Rat is a Pig is a Dog is a Boy, The Human Cost of the Animal Rights Movement, which seems to be a critique of the attempt by animal rights activists to put humans and animals on exactly the same level. So if this is a subject that you're interested in, you might want to check that work out.
Is there anything else you'd like to say before we close?
Just that the article we've been covering today is not the only item of recent research into animals and death. I also discovered 2 other articles that deal with what happens with animals on the other side of death, that is, after they've died. So in a future episode, we'll be looking at the animal equivalent of another experience that's been reported with humans, that is, after-death communications, or ADCs. It turns out these have been reported with animals too, and thus far, researchers have collected more than 1,000 accounts of them. So when we deal with those, we'll have the happy experience of talking about animals who at least seemingly have contacted their owners from the great beyond.
So Jimmy, what's your bottom line here?
Humans display a range of phenomena that are classified as end-of-life experiences or ELEs. In this episode, we briefly surveyed some of the common ones, and we'll talk more about them in the future, in addition to the episodes that we've already done about them. Well, it turns out that these same ELEs, whether normal or paranormal, may have parallels with at least the higher animals. Much more research and data are needed on those, but preliminary reports indicate that higher animals experience the same kind of things, including premonitions of death and even deathbed visions. We need to be cautious here and not make hasty conclusions, but the evidence we have at hand is, as Mr. Spock would say, fascinating.
And what further resources can we offer?
We'll have a link to Sheldrake Smart and Nom's paper, Experiences of Dying Animals, Parallels with End-of-Life Experiences in Humans. Also, the case collection in an Excel spreadsheet that accompanies the article. We'll also have links to Alexander Bathiany's book, Threshold, Terminal Lucidity and the Border of Life and Death, Susan Monso's book, Play and Possum, How Animals Understand Death, Wesley Smith's book, A Rat is a Pig is a Dog is a Boy, The Human Cost of the Animal Rights Movement, and Patricia Pearson's article, Phenomena Related to Danger, Death, and Bereavement.
Very good. And so now we turn to our mysterious feedback that is brought to us, as usual, by our feedback coordinator, Rob Leonardi. And our first feedback comes from our episode on the Amityville Horror, number 358. Lawrence Stanley, 8989, on YouTube writes, "The idea that the dead can come back and haunt the living has been an idea that has existed in just about every culture on Earth. Even the disciples of Christ had this kind of an idea, but do ghosts, the bodiless spirits of the dead, actually exist? If the term ghost is intended merely to mean spirit beings, and the Bible will refer to these as Elohim, then the answer is an absolute yes, they certainly do exist. If the term ghost means spirits of people who have died," and he references Isaiah 19:3, "then the answer is emphatically no. The Bible makes it abundantly clear that there are indeed spirit beings, both good and evil, Elohim, who operate here on earth and interact with the lives of people, but it negates the idea that the spirits of deceased human beings can remain on earth and haunt the living, Job 7:9-10. And on that same note, there is no such thing as an exorcism. If you want a demon gone, you need to get saved."
So Lawrence Stanley, 8989, I think is correct on some points here. The Bible does use the term Elohim as a general term for spirit beings. It can refer to the creator. It can refer to pagan deities. It can refer to angels and demons, and it can refer to departed human souls. So anything that's a spirit being can be called an Elohim in Hebrew. He's also correct that non-human spirit beings interact with humans, but I'm afraid I have to disagree that he's also correct that the disciples of Jesus had the idea of a ghost, because at various points when they see Jesus in circumstances they shouldn't, they think, oh, it's a ghost. But I have to disagree with Lawrence Stanley, 8989, that ghosts of humans do not interact with people. That has never been the Christian understanding, and it is not mandated by the Bible. He cites Job chapter 7, verses 9 and 10 as evidence that deceased humans don't remain on earth and haunt the living. And that passage says, as the cloud fades and vanishes, so he who goes down to Sheol, that's the realm of the dead, does not come up. He returns no more to his house, nor does his place know him anymore. Now, in order to get out of that the idea that ghosts never haunt the living, you have to apply an absolutizing hermeneutic to that passage in Job, because it's quite possible for humans to articulate general principles that do admit of exceptions. For example, I could say nobody comes back from the dead, or in this life, nobody comes back from the dead, or in our day, nobody comes back from the dead, or things like that, and not be thinking about Lazarus and the widow of Nain's son and Jairus' daughter and Jesus himself, or all the people who experience clinical death in hospitals and then have their heart shocked and return to physical life. So I can articulate a general principle about the permanence of death without meaning there are no exceptions. And similarly, when Job is saying that the cloud fades and vanishes, as the cloud fades and vanishes, so is he who goes down to Sheol does not come up. he's thinking there of resurrection. He's not thinking there of the person's spirit coming back. So that's not even the same thing. He says he returns to his house no more, nor does his place know him anymore. That's a general principle. That doesn't mean it's exceptionless. And so in order to get out of that, the idea that human spirits can never return, you have to apply an absolutizing hermeneutic that is not warranted by the text. You're going beyond the text and reading it in a more wooden way than the author intends. And we actually have evidence of human spirits coming back and talking to people, like the spirit of the prophet Samuel. If you read in 1 Samuel 28, when Saul actually uses a medium to conjure up the spirit of Samuel, the author of the text indicates that is Samuel. He's not talking, people will say, oh, it's a demon. But no, the text does not indicate that this is a demon. There is no hint of that in the text. Instead, the author flatly says it was Samuel and that Saul knew it was Samuel, using the factive verb knew, which implies truth. You don't know something if it isn't true. So the author is endorsing the idea this really is Samuel. And so in at least exceptional circumstances, departed human spirits can come back as part of God's providence. Also, in terms of an exorcism, you say on the same note, there's no such thing as an exorcism. Well, our Lord Jesus Christ would kind of disagree with that, since he performed exorcisms repeatedly and was known as an exorcist, and he endorsed his disciples performing exorcisms. It says he gave them power to drive out demons, and he acknowledged other people had this power too. He refers to other Jewish exorcists who he accepts were genuine exorcists. So demons do not uniquely haunt the unsaved, and there are ways of getting rid of them through exorcisms.
And our next set of feedback comes from episode 359 on the Fouke Monster. We got two voicemails. The first one comes from Penelope, and Penelope says,
Hi, Jimmy and Dom. My name is Penelope. I enjoyed the recent episode on the Fouke Monster, and when Jimmy said he'd like to have somebody write a song about the Fouke Monster in Boggy Town in Arkansas, I was inspired to write one. And here's my song, Boggy Town. Down in the mid-south in Arkansas, there's a town called Boggy Town. Some say that there's a monster there or somewhere thereabouts. You don't know if the story's true, but you're going down to find out. You're going down to find out. You're going down to Boggy Town. You're looking for the monster.
And we'll have the full song of Penelope's Boggy Town after the final credits of the show, so you can listen to the whole thing for yourself. I think it was a really creative song. It's one of two that listeners have mentioned. So if our other listeners who have also been writing a version of a Boggy Town song are able to send us their version, we'll play it as well.
Our next feedback comes from June in Pennsylvania.
Hi, this is June in Pennsylvania. Why can't the Fouke Monster be a very tall, crazy guy with extreme hirsutism who was either cast out by his horrified family or else ran off and has survived by eating small animals, hence the interest in the dog, ? Bye. Thank you for your great show. Love it, love it.
Okay. By the way, I enjoyed the verbal punctuation. In answer to June's question, it's not intrinsically possible that the Fouke Monster could be a very tall, crazy human who has extreme hirsutism. I mean, there is a form of skin condition where people grow hair all over their skin. And we talked about that back in our episode on werewolves. But that wouldn't explain everything. It wouldn't explain, for example, the 3 or 4 clawed tracks that they found. And we're building a pretty unique scenario here where we've got a guy who has multiple conditions that make him unusual. He's very tall. He's crazy, so he's willing to attack this house. even though people have been shooting at him with shotguns and he's unarmed. He's got extreme hirsutism. He lives in the woods. He apparently doesn't wear clothes. All of this is very unique. And people tend to notice things that are unique. So the idea that you'd have something this rare that nobody knew about would, to my mind, make this a less plausible scenario than that this was a bear attack. Or if you think that cryptids like Bigfoot exist, that it was a Bigfoot attack. Because anytime you have someone who meets these very specific characteristics, other humans are going to know about that person, and nobody knew about such a person in this instance.
And then our next feedback comes from Terrence Gearnart 1204 on YouTube. I wonder if the fact that they were never able to hit the creature with multiple shots from shotguns suggests that maybe law enforcement gave them blanks, which might open the hoax by police possibility. Your dismissal of this is based on how foolish it would be to put yourself in danger, but law enforcement lending them weapons is suspicious in itself. If they controlled the source of the weaponry and ammunition, they could ensure the safety of the hoaxers.
Yeah, that's not actually how blanks work. Blanks themselves are dangerous. They're not as dangerous as if there's a bullet in there, but the exploding gunpowder itself is dangerous. And if you're within a few feet of a blank that's shot, you will get injured. So blanks are not a guaranteed safety situation. Also, even if the local constable had given them a shotgun with blanks in it, they likely could. He would have no way of knowing whether they're gonna put new shells in it, and the new shells they would put in it, might not be blanks. And so even if he gave them a box of blanks, once the gun is out of your control, it is out of your control. And so you don't know what somebody's going to do with it. And it would be a hideous, ridiculous violation of gun safety to give someone a loaded gun, even loaded with blanks, and then expect it to be perfectly safe for them to fire it at you. That's not how these things work. It's also, I find it very implausible that local police would be setting up a hoax and give people guns with blanks to defend themselves against it. That's just extremely implausible for a thing that law enforcement would do. It's much more plausible for law enforcement to say, oh, there's some kind of animal or bear or something attacking them. And so, yeah, here's a couple of shotguns to deal with it with real shot shells.
All right. And that's all our feedback for this time. And now it's time to hear from you. What are your theories about animals and their end-of-life experiences? You can let us know by visiting sqpn.com or the Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World Facebook page, sending us an email to feedback@mysterious.fm, sending a tweet to @mys_world, visiting the StarQuest Discord community at sqpn.com/discord, or calling our mysterious feedback line at 619-738-4515. That's 619-738-4515.
And I want to say a special word of thanks to Oasis Studio 7 for the video and animation work on this episode. Check it out at my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Jimmy Akin. While you're there, be sure and like, comment, and subscribe, and also hit the bell notification so you always get notified when I have a new video.
Excellent. So, Jimmy, what's our next episode going to be about?
Next week is a Fifth Friday, so we're going to be doing a Fifth Friday Weird Questions episode, and we're going to be talking about subjects like whether the fall of men and angels was fated to happen, whether Jesus could simultaneously incarnate as all of the different races of Middle-earth, how a pope would be elected in the aftermath of a worldwide calamity, how much loot the Magi gave to the Holy Family, where the idea of aerial toll houses came from, which laws would have to apply in other universes, and why lunch meat is mostly round while bread is mostly square.
That's the one I need the answer to. All right. Folks, be sure to share the podcast with your friends and write a review in Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcast from to help us grow our community and reach more listeners. Be sure to get your very own Mysterious World t-shirt, mug, and more in our merchandise shop at sqpn.com/merch. You'll find links to Jimmy's resources from our discussion on our show notes at mysterious.fm/366. And remember, to help us continue to produce the podcast, please visit sqpn.com/give. Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is also brought to you in part by Rosary Army, featuring award-winning Catholic podcasts, rosary resources, videos, and the School of Mary online community, prayer, and learning platform. Learn how to make them, pray them, and give them away while growing in your faith at rosaryarmy.com and schoolofmary.com. And by The Grady Group, a Catholic company bringing financial clarity to their clients across the United States, using safe money options to produce reasonable rates of return for their clients. Learn more at gradygroupinc.com. Until next time, Jimmy Akin, thank you for exploring with us our mysterious world.
Thanks, Dom.
And once again, I'm Dom Bettinelli. Thank you for listening to Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World on StarQuest.
Down in the midst of an Arkansas, there's a town called Boggy Town. Some say that there's a monster there or somewhere thereabouts. You don't know if the story's true, but you're going down to find out. You're going down to find out. You're going down to Boggy Town. You're looking for the monster. You're going down to Boggy Town. You're going down Boggy Creek. But what you gonna do if you ever find the monster that you seek? What you gonna do if you ever find the monster that you seek? Some say the monster is 7 feet tall and covered in shaggy hair. Too big to be a human, too big to be a bear. A cousin of Bigfoot, a cousin of Sasquatch, or something thereabouts. You don't know if the story's true, but you're going down to find out. You're going down to find out. You're going down to Boggy Town. You're looking for the monster. You're going down to Boggy Town. You're going down Boggy Creek. But what you gonna do if you ever find the monster that you seek? What you gonna do if you ever find the monster that you seek? If you find the monster, will you run away? Will you climb the nearest tree? Will you shoot it with your rifle? Will you let it go free? Will you take it home for toast and tea? Will you take it to the zoo? What you gonna do? What you gonna do? You're going down to Boggy Town. You're looking for the monster. You're going down to Boggy Town. You're going down Boggy Creek. But what you gonna do if you ever find the monster that you seek? What you gonna do if you ever find the monster that you seek?